Good morning, everyone. Welcome to The Bubble, the weekly video podcast series in which we look back on the week at major political events impacting London. In order to help us make sense of everything, we have the privilege of having the knowledge, the experience, and the insight from none other than the former Deputy Mayor of London himself, Mr. Roger Evans. Roger, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning, Paul. I'm good. Was up fairly late last night, looking at the results of the American election, and ready to talk to you about politics this week.
Fantastic. Well, let's start off then with the first segment entitled Headline of the Week, in which we choose a major headline that we feel is going to impact London, politically speaking. So, Roger, what headline have you chosen to go with this week?
Well, I think we can't ignore the result of the US election, even though we traditionally just talk about things that affect London. And of course, this will have a considerable effect on our city and our relationship with the US and the rest of the world. I watched Biden's speech yesterday. I was very impressed with the way that he decided to offer an olive branch to political opponents and offered to work with them, because that's something we've not had enough of in politics at the moment. And the polarization of either wing of politics is a very worrying thing. You know, the inability to accept the results of popular votes, whether it's the US election currently or the Brexit vote that we had, the inability of opponents to see other people's point of view is fracturing society, and it has to change. And I hope Biden's speech actually heralds a move back towards cooperation and understanding people and working with them. I also watched Kamala Harris. I think we must keep an eye on her, because she could actually end up being the president at some point. And I was quite impressed with the speech that she gave. It's a great thing for the United States to have their first woman vice president, although they're a little bit late to the party when you consider that we had our first woman prime minister back in the last century now, and they have yet to have a woman president. So they're doing well. They're catching up. I think one of the more amusing reactions I saw was the number of Americans who were claiming that the fireworks we were having in London were a celebration of Biden's victory. They obviously don't realize there are other reasons for us to be letting off fireworks at this time of year, which have a greater historical significance than yesterday's election results, significant though it was.
Absolutely. I'm surprised that they've confused the American elections with, obviously, bonfire night and what have you. But on that particular point, do you think that America under a Biden administration will be a friend to the UK given past comments, particularly around Brexit, or do we have nothing to be afraid of?
I think we're certainly going to have to do some work to satisfy that administration around the border issues in Northern Ireland. And maybe that's no bad thing, that we actually get our ideas straight about what is going to happen there. Beyond that, I think that there will still be a good relationship. There has historically been. And if we're looking at the issue of a trade deal, at the end of the day, it's still much easier for the US to get a trade deal with the United Kingdom on its own than it is to agree one with the 27 different countries of the European Union, all of whom have a veto. I think back to my time on European committees, and there was actually a great deal of latent anti-Americanism within the European Union. The European superstate project was seen as a counter to American power. and there was reluctance constantly to actually sign up to trade deals with the US and to work with them. And that's not gone away. So I think, regardless of some of the rhetoric that we've seen, the US will still find the United Kingdom easier to work with than the EU.
From what I've seen so far of the American election, it seems as though the Republicans are really going to contest this vote, alleging voter fraud on a massive scale. I get the feeling this is going to get very messy. And even though Biden has been announced as the president-elect, it's going to be quite some time before America finally officially announces who the next president is going to be. How do you think that's going to affect relations between the UK and even London to some degree and the US in the meantime?
Well, the one thing that financial markets feared more than anything else was a contested election where the result was too close to call and there were arguments about it. I think Biden appears to have got a significant enough majority that he will come through as the winner in the end. Was there fraud? I think undoubtedly there will have been items of instances of individual election fraud. It happens in pretty much every election. And when it comes to council elections, of course, as we've seen in some boroughs in London, individual cases of election fraud can affect the result because the number of voters is small and the turnout is low. But when you have a situation where the number of voters is massive, as in this case, and also where the turnout has been huge as well because of the postal vote requirement around coronavirus, the turnout was much higher than usual. Where the turnout is that high, it tends to drown out cases of electoral fraud. They're just swept up amongst the general move in public opinion. What Trump seems to be alleging is there was fraud in the way that the election was administered in some places. That's a totally different ballgame to fraud carried out by individuals or groups. And I've seen that accusation made before by people who've lost in the UK. They've never been able to prove it, and it tends to have been fringe candidates who don't really understand the process who make that accusation. So it's going to be very hard to make accusations that the system itself was corrupt stick, particularly, of course, as but Trump as president has been in charge of the US and in charge of the system for the last 4 years.
Well, as I said, I get the feeling that this is going to get incredibly messy and be ultimately very long drawn out, but hopefully we'll get an announcement, an official announcement soon enough so that we can start getting back to some degree of normality one way or the other.
Well, I noticed Boris has now congratulated Biden on his victory, so that's a start toward building a new relationship between the governments.
I certainly hope so. Certainly hope so. For my part, I've chosen the best coronavirus testing up in Liverpool. Now, what we're seeing up in Liverpool is effectively the offshoot to Operation Moonshot, which is the plan that was announced by the Prime Minister some months ago to test in excess of 10 million people every single day by 2021, which in itself is a huge and incredibly ambitious target to set. But nonetheless, what we're seeing in Liverpool is really a prelude to achieving that particular goal. If it's successful, and this is actually why I've chosen it as my headline of the week, is that the intention is to then roll it out in London. Logistically speaking, I don't think the challenge can be overestimated because there is a huge chasm of difference between testing in a city like Liverpool with a population of 500,000 compared to doing the same thing in a city the size of London, where the population is in excess of 9 million people. Nonetheless, to help with the logistical challenge up in Liverpool, what we have seen is the army drafted in order to help set up testing centres and to help administer the tests. That being the case, then Londoners can fully expect to see soldiers on the streets of London, which for some might prove quite concerning. Nonetheless, going back to Liverpool and focusing specifically on the test itself, it's already faced a number of concerns and issues. First and foremost, and this is perhaps the most prominent of the issues and concerns, is that they are testing not only symptomatic people, but also asymptomatic people. So that goes in the face of the scientific advice given to the government by the SAGE group, who said that the government should prioritise symptomatic people due to the limited resources available. On the ground level, there's been some outrage because, I don't know, Roger, if you saw it, but outside one particular testing centre, there was an incredibly long queue of people waiting to be tested. And it was only once they got to the front of the queue that they were asked whether they were symptomatic or asymptomatic, which was a clear indicator that they had been in the queue for several hours, much to their dismay, with people who were genuinely sick and had symptoms. So naturally, as you can probably imagine, they weren't best pleased. In fact, one eyewitness said it was a complete and utter shambles. So it hasn't got off to the best of starts by any means of the imagination. Going back to the testing itself, what's interesting is that the government are trialling a new rapid test. It's called the direct RT lab test, and it differs from the PCR test in the sense that it uses a different enzyme to test samples. What it allows to do is to test samples at a single temperature, whereas the PCR test has to be run multiple times and tested at different temperatures. And that is why it takes such a long time to actually get a result from the PCR test. But with this new test, you're able to get a result within 20 minutes. However, there is a compromise. There is a compromise because even though you get the results quicker, there are certain question marks concerning the accuracy of the test itself. Now, the tests were initially designed to be rolled out to NHS frontline workers initially, but a trial study in Manchester by academics found that the test failed to accurately detect positive cases in more than 50% of samples tested. Now, that in itself is a huge blow to the government, who have invested somewhere in the region of about £100 billion into this programme. Now, the government have obviously acknowledged the results of this test, but they have countered that by claiming other trials have found the test accuracy levels to be somewhere between 80 to 96%. So clearly there are fundamental issues surrounding the accuracy of the test itself and around mass testing generally speaking, and yet the government is still pressing ahead with the programme, highly flawed though it is. So my question to you, Roger, is, do you think that this new test stands a chance, a credible chance, of surviving and being rolled out nationally? And do you think that 9 million Londoners will embrace mass testing?
Well, where to start with all of this? I think, first of all, the more information we have about the prevalence of the virus, the better, because some of the figures that are quoted about how many people have had it or how many people have got it seem a bit strange. But to get a total picture of how prevalent the virus is within the population, you do need to test asymptomatic people as well as symptomatic ones. If the only people you're testing are people who are turning up who are already feeling unwell, which is the current situation, then you're dealing with a sample which is already biased and in which COVID is much more likely to occur than it is if you test asymptomatic people too. You also miss, by the way, the people who have COVID but don't have any symptoms. And I would be very interested to see if suggestions that, you know, only a low percentage of the population have had COVID actually stand up to this new test, because it's my suspicion that a disease that spreads as easily as this has actually passed through a larger portion of the population than the scientists are thinking. And it will be interesting to test that with the new process. Now, we talk about accuracy, and it would be great if we had tests that were 100% accurate. But 12 months ago, we didn't have tests at all. This is an area in which the science is developing, as I've said in the past. So you have to treat the figures with caution because of the level of inaccuracies. But if you carry on doing the tests the same way over a period of time, and those inaccuracies don't change, then what you can do is look at the trend, because the trend will stand up if the same level of factors are applied each time that the test is done. So you'll be able to see what is happening over time. And also over time, I expect that the accuracy of the tests will improve further. We've made a lot of improvements to how we treat this infection and how we stop it spreading. And better science ultimately is the alternative we have to the rather clumsy lockdown approach we've got now, which covers everybody. Looking at testing mass populations, you've got to be careful about comparing apples with pears here. Liverpool has a relatively low number of people there because the administrative boundaries of the city are quite tight. So relatively few people are taken in underneath Liverpool City Council. It's a little bit like the equivalent of having Zone 1 or maybe Zone 1 and 2 of London under the Greater London Authority rather than the wider suburbs. In that respect, of course, London is more similar to Greater Merseyside or to an authority like Bradford, which has quite a large area. So comparing cities, you always have to think about where the boundaries are drawn. Clearly, it's a huge task in a place like London, so the government are sensible to trial it elsewhere. Whether I'd have trialed it in Liverpool, I'm not so sure, because that is a place where there is a history of skepticism about things that the government will do, and a history of perhaps people not complying. But obviously they've got the support of the city council and of the wider metropolitan council and the authorities there to do it. So it's a start, and I'll be interested to see what the results are like.
Do you think, though, that the testing methods used are an accurate indicator as to the true prevalence of the virus, when we know that A, the tests were never meant for diagnostic purposes, and B, there's still huge question marks around the accuracy of those tests?
Well, they're the best thing that we've got. They're not ideal, but they're better than doing nothing. The actual test that I would like to see used is a test not just of who's got the virus, but actually of who's had it as well. Because I think that information, the information about who's got the virus, is great for planning health service capacity. But the information about who's had it and how far it's spread through the population will tell us a lot of things about how we need to respond on wider fronts, the economic fronts, and how we balance the risk to the population against the risk of lockdown, which is there as well, of course.
There still remains a tremendous amount of skepticism, as I said, around the testing, particularly around the false positive rate, which the government to this day haven't announced what it is, perhaps because they don't know. But why doesn't the government just simply adopt a two-test procedure, whereby the second test, if it does prove to be positive, mitigates the risk of any potential false positive? Why doesn't the government do that, do you think?
So you'd be doing two tests for everyone rather than one. What happens if one goes one way and one goes the other way? Would you need to do best of three? At what point do you do you stop? And of course, you've got to bear in mind, if you're doubling the number of tests you're carrying out, which is effectively what you're doing if you're doing 2 tests on everybody, that's twice the expense, it's twice the length of time before you get the results, it's twice the number of appointments that everyone needs to go to be tested. But there must come a point where the financial burden and the administrative burden and the burden on people taking part will cause the system to fall apart. I imagine the government are looking at it as a possibility, but let's see how it works with 1 test first before we go down that route.
Okay. On to our next segment called In the Spotlight, where we cast the focus of our attention on a particular political figure. This week, it's Shaun Bailey, the Conservative candidate for Mayor of London. Shaun, Roger, what are your impressions of Shaun? And do you think the Conservatives made the right choice in selecting him as their candidate for Mayor of London?
Well, I think as to your second question, we'll find that out when we see the election result in May. As to your first question, I've known Shaun for 4 years now. I met him first actually on election night at City Hall when he won his London Assembly seat, and I was on my way out of City Hall and he was on his way in, and I chatted to him a bit then. He's in many ways he's very impressive. He's particularly got a lot of energy, which I think that you need to have to contest a long campaign for London Mayor. The campaigns we used to run for the London Assembly were 6 months or so, and that was quite draining, but the campaign for London Mayor is even longer. So he's got a lot of energy, he's got a lot of enthusiasm, he's very good at motivating people. He's someone who could stand up on a stage and shout "let's go" to everyone, and people will follow him. If there's a downside, I think he needs more of a vision for the city. And it's a criticism I'd make, I think, of all the candidates, actually, including the current mayor, that there doesn't seem to be a coherent vision for what they would like London to look like in future. And perhaps, as I've said before, it's time for us to move away from simply growing the city to saying, how do we make life better for people who live here, rather than cramming more and more people into the space. It may be very satisfying for a mayor to have more people wanting to come to live in London, but I think you need to actually think, how do we make the city better for the people who are already here? If I had advice for Shaun, I think I would suggest that he maybe takes the government to task a bit more often. Sadiq has made it a bit of a thing to pick fights with the government, sometimes unnecessarily, but devolved politicians need to be able to stand up to national government. And I don't see him doing a lot of disagreeing with the government's position in a way that a candidate like Stephen Norris did when he was Conservative candidate, or in fact that Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson did with their own governments when they were mayors. That's something which is essential in devolved administrations. And the other thing I'd like to see a bit more of the new Bidenism that we're seeing, which is I would define as a willingness to work with others. London is a city which it's got a big Conservative vote in the suburbs, but you have to be prepared to work with other people who disagree with you as well. And both Ken Livingstone, perhaps surprisingly, and Boris Johnson had political opponents within their cabinet, people from other political parties, to keep them grounded. It's something that Sadiq hasn't done, and I think that's been a mistake on his part. And it's a mistake that Shaun could exploit if he demonstrated that he was prepared to work with political opponents a bit more. And remember, of course, this is an election with a two-stage vote. So you get a first vote for who you want, and then everyone who didn't make the cut to the last two has their second vote redistributed amongst the two final candidates. Now, I would expect Shaun to make it to the final as a candidate from one of the two major parties. But to actually win that, he needs second preference votes from Liberal Democrats and Greens, and UKIPers and political opponents generally. And I'm not sure he's going to be getting that at the moment unless he does more cooperative stuff.
There's a saying that London is very much a Labour city, although I've always seen it predominantly more as an anti-Tory city rather than necessarily a pro-Labour city. So bearing that in mind, do you think that Shaun stands a chance of making some serious inroads in terms of winning the popular second vote?
I think it's not so much an anti-Tory city as an anti-government city. One of the things that we noticed with election results for the London Assembly, for instance, is the Conservative vote did best during those years when we had a Labour government. We actually got quite a good Conservative vote, even at the first election in 2000. We returned 9 members, the joint largest group there, even though Blair was still effectively in his honeymoon with the press. A lot of people in London were prepared to give us a hearing. Now, since we've been in government, our vote has declined as the protest vote goes the other way. And that started in 2012 when we lost 2 London Assembly seats. Again, in 2016, we lost another one. And that's the other thing, of course, when Shaun wins, if he wins, he's going to need to have a block of support within the Assembly. Otherwise, his budgets and strategies and political proposals will all be challengeable, and they'll all be changed by the Assembly. So you need to get back to the Assembly, not just with a Conservative mayor, but with at least 9 members to be able to defend your key policy positions. So the Assembly election is important. We shouldn't forget that.
The latest poll has Sadiq Khan somewhere in the 50% region, with Shaun trailing in second at 28%. Do you think that Shaun stands a genuine chance of winning the election, or is it effectively in the bag for Sadiq Khan and Labour?
I think that's a massive lead to overcome. And normally you would say that it was a done deal by now. I'm reluctant to call the election at this stage simply because there are so many factors that we don't understand between now and then, including the effect of COVID. I noticed Sadiq yesterday was encouraging people to register to vote by post because of COVID. And there'll be a whole bunch of new voters out there who are up for registering and up for voting. And Sadiq, I think, will be justified in thinking quite a lot of them will break for him. But we don't know. We don't actually know what those people are going to do until we count the ballots. So well, I still think it's there to play for. But it would be easier, I think, for a candidate with Shaun's energy who likes to get out and about if we weren't doing this during a pandemic when we're all effectively sealed up inside and he can't deploy his greatest strength.
With that said, do you think that external events, whether it be the pandemic or Brexit, have actually worked against Shaun, but at the same time actually worked in favour of Sadiq Khan because it takes the focus away from his performance as Mayor of London?
Well, I think Sadiq has played Brexit quite cleverly because London is very much a Remain city, certainly the centre of London and the zones in the centre are. And Sadiq was always very careful not to position himself too close to Jeremy Corbyn, despite, of course, having nominated him in the first place. And we had all of that stuff with the European flag being a part of the fireworks celebrations a couple of years ago. So he's seeing the way the wind is blowing, and he's bidding for second votes from all of those Remainers who would support the Greens or the Liberal Democrats. And we actually saw during Corbyn's leadership a drift away from Labour towards the Liberal Democrats amongst that sort of middle-class Remain part of London, particularly the suburbs out in the south and the west. And Sadiq will be hoping to get a lot of those voters back now that the problems of Corbyn are gone, and with Brexit not yet not yet resolved. Obviously, I think we'd like to judge the mayor on his performance in office, and one of the problems we always have with elections at local level, whether it's for the mayor or for local councils, is they're often portrayed as a referendum on the performance of the government. The candidates will say, perhaps ironically, I've not got much power, so it doesn't really matter who you vote for at this election, so use it as a referendum to demonstrate your displeasure to the government. So I think the other thing I'd be doing if I was Shaun would be really focusing on the issues where Sadiq has struggled to actually make a difference in London, particularly the failure to hit housing targets, and the ongoing problem of crime, and particularly knife crime. I think those are the places to go for. I'd be less inclined to critique about the financial situation at Transport for London, which Shaun has done a lot of recently, simply because the COVID collapse in passenger numbers really buries any particular financial concerns there might have been before. And it was always inevitable that Transport for London would get the money from government. TfL in that respect is rather like the big banks. It can't be allowed to fail. It's too big to fail, because to withdraw transport services from London would disadvantage and hurt so many people and so many businesses. So at the end of the day, the government were always going to pay up, I think.
So just finally to wrap up, Roger, in your opinion, how would you sum up exactly what kind of strategy Shaun's campaign team needs in order to give him a standing chance of winning this election and becoming the next mayor of London?
It needs a strategy which is more inclusive of other people's points of view. If I was Shaun, I'd be getting out there and meeting some of the community campaigners that we see on Twitter and on Facebook so often. A lot of you think about people who protest about the expansion of Heathrow Airport, the people who are protesting about the Silvertown Tunnel, the leaseholders who are stuck in blocks of flats and are going to have to pay large amounts of money for their cladding to be replaced following the recommendations of the Grenfell inquiry. I think he needs to be getting out and talking to more people like that and standing up for them. And the communities around London, the Latin American community is now very big in London. And I did a lot of work with them when I was deputy mayor, and yet a lot of them seem to be declaring for Sadiq at the moment. I think Shaun should probably go and talk to them. The Jewish community, really, there are, I think, a lot more places where he should be getting out to rather than actually just broadcasting from behind a desk. And I appreciate, of course, that COVID makes that particularly difficult at the moment. Ideally for a mayoral campaign, you would want to have a longer period of time to meet all these people, to build recognition and to run up to the election. But we are where we are and we have to work with what we've got.
Wise words indeed. I hope his campaign team are listening to this. Now moving on to other news, there's been a big announcement in that the GLA are going to be moving premises. Perhaps you can shed some more light on that and what your particular view on that is.
Yes, this is the move from City Hall. When we moved into City Hall, there was a break clause which enabled the GLA to get out of the agreement and move to a different building after, I think, 25 years. And of course, we're coming up to that point now. And Sadiq has said that the costs of remaining at City Hall are high. They want to move to this building, which is known as the Crystal, used to be known as the Siemens Crystal because Siemens were the first people who occupied it. But it's a building owned by City Hall. It's out in Docklands. It's ironically actually just next to the terminus of the cable car over the river. So I think if they move there, we may see a lot more use of the cable car by City Hall employees traveling backwards and forwards. I think it's an approach which has been criticized, but I remember when we first moved to the existing City Hall, because of course, when the Assembly was first elected, it was homeless. We were actually in a converted hotel, which was rather nice, in West London for a couple of years while they built City Hall. And there was a great deal of grumbling when we moved to City Hall. You know, how can we all move out east? We're moving away from Westminster and the political centre, particularly the Assembly members who didn't come from East London. Thought that they, or for south of the river, thought that they were moving into dangerous territory. Indeed, at that time, the area around More London was very different from how it is now. But City Hall was opened, we moved there, it regenerated the area around. So we got lots of big businesses that moved into that area, and values went up, and the area is transformed from how it was 20 years ago. And I think the move out to the Crystal has the potential to transform that part of East London and continue to drive the improvements there as well. So in addition to saving money, and there will be some costs too, it will also actually have a very positive impact on the area around it. And I think, having watched a couple of meetings where they discuss this, the mayor has committed to continue to operate some premises in central London so that Assembly members can continue to work from there if we're worried about accessibility to the central London institutions or to places like TfL headquarters. But most of the people will be heading out to the Crystal, and they're looking at saving some money on the City Hall deal, which on balance I think is a good thing. I don't often agree with what Sadiq does, but I think he's probably made the right decision here.
Quite interestingly, MP Gareth Bacon, who quite ironically still sits on the London Assembly due to the postponement of the London mayoral and London Assembly elections, he says that the move to from City Hall to the Crystal would, according to the mayor, save the administration £12 million a year. But Gareth also claims that the moving costs have already rocketed by 70%, and that the mayor actually rejected a substantial reduction in rent. But in addition to that, more than £10 million has been lost in failing to rent out the Crystal. Do you think that the mayor has missed a trick here? And actually, there was a route to actually saving the GLA far more money had it remained where it is rather than moving to the Crystal.
Well, Gareth's an old colleague, and he's been the chairman of the City Hall Budget Committee for a few years, so he knows his stuff, and I clearly respect what he's saying here. But of course, you have to bear in mind that moving costs may be high, but they're a one-off. You do it once, and you'll be out there, probably for 20 years, as they were at City Hall. So yeah, you've got high costs in 1 year, but you've got 19 years of savings afterwards. If you're talking about having lost 10 million by not renting out the Crystal, that presumes that you could rent it out in the first place and that there was demand for taking it, which is not always the case. Actually, I've seen cases of other buildings in East London which have been promoted by local authorities there, but they've been unable to find people to take them on, and they've ended up putting some of their own departments into them. And if they can't rent the building out, then of course it's not a profit, it's a cost on the account. One of the things that we know from City Hall is if you move the centre of government into a building in a location like that, all right, no one was willing to rent the building beforehand, but it makes the whole area much more desirable for other businesses to come and settle around it. That's what happened at Tower Bridge when we moved there. So I can see it having the same effect here. A rent reduction, I I can understand actually why the owners of City Hall would offer a reduction, because the building will be very difficult to use for anything else. It was specifically designed for democratic purposes, and there's a lot of empty space in there. There's lots of holes in the floors, so you don't get the square footage that you would in a commercial building. And the shape is odd as well. It's very difficult to efficiently divide up and furnish a building which is that shape. If you look at the elections we have every 4 years for the assembly, when assembly groups change sizes, the groups are located on the 6th and 7th floor, they have to change the number of offices that members occupy, and that means they have to move the partition between the group areas. And every time they did this, they had to not just move the partition, they had to actually go back to the manufacturers and get a new one made, because the corridor would be a different size in the place they were moving the partition to. And that was a fundamental weakness, a fundamental flaw in the design of a building, which I think architects were much more excited about than the people who worked there. But at the age the building is now, it won't just be about rents. I suspect there will be quite a lot of maintenance costs and repairs to the building, which will be coming in about this time and will be quite high as well. So moving will avoid those too.
Moving on to a different topic from me, Roger. There was an article, I don't know if you saw it in The Guardian, but an organisation called the Combined Homelessness and Information Network found that homelessness in under 25s had increased significantly in the past 12 months due to the COVID restrictions. They found that there was a rise to 368 this year from 250 over the same period last year. So that's effectively an increase of about 47%, which is incredibly worrying. And again, this has really kind of arisen due to people not being able to stay at the homes of friends in times of difficulty. Now, we know that City Hall and the Mayor of London has responsibility for housing, and obviously the local council's responsibility for addressing and tackling homelessness. Between the two of them, what would you like to see them collectively doing in order to address this increasing and rather concerning issue within the capital?
Well, one of the things that we noticed back in March at the start of lockdown was that homelessness was one of the things, street sleeping anyway, was one of the things that was tackled by government and by local councils. And it was very noticeable in Romford, where we had quite a large population of street sleepers, that they all disappeared pretty quickly. So the council must clearly have been quite efficient at finding them somewhere else to go and taking them off the street where they were in more danger during the pandemic. And those people, by and large, haven't come back since the pandemic was over. But what we've seen is people appearing, sleeping in the street who are new, and they're not the same people who were helped before. So I think a renewal of those measures is necessary to combat that problem. I think that the problem identified for under 25s has most likely gone under the radar, because it's not one of the things which they would talk about at stage, and it's not something that would be factored in until people realised it was happening. So the mayor and the councils, with government help, need to be rather fleet of foot to be able to pick up that problem and react to it. And just looking at it generally, of course, homelessness it's affected by poverty, but really it's driven by mental health issues. And one of the big problems with lockdown is that we're seeing a lot of mental health problems being exacerbated. The whole business of depriving people of their normal lives, of their contact with others, locking them up at home, is exaggerating and making worse a lot of people's mental health problems. So if we're not careful, we could actually see increasing homelessness, where people just decide they can't cope with the system, and they drop out and they end up sleeping on the street. That could be a feature which has not been foreseen in the past of the lockdown approach, and it's something that the government need to consider. Their mental health strategy has been quite good during this, but I'm not sure it's extended far enough to considering the effect on homelessness numbers, which is going to take place downstream of the lockdowns.
Well, homelessness has always been a rather complicated issue, even at the best of times, and we're obviously in very extraordinary circumstances. So no doubt the issues surrounding mental health will further complicate things, and I honestly hope that everyone comes together, irrespective of their political beliefs, and actually work to resolve this problem, because it is a very serious problem, and it's a problem that will only increase further unless someone really does something meaningful to tackle it.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've noticed is there seems to have been, certainly in my high street, an increase in the spirit of generosity of people. So there are more people giving our street sleepers food, giving them money, and just deciding to do it off their own bat rather than it being done through charitable groups and organisations. And maybe that desire to look out for each other might be a silver lining that we get from all this.
And long may it continue. Long may it continue. Moving on to the next topic, there was a study that was commissioned by TfL, where Imperial College took to the tube network and carried out a range of testing to see if there was COVID within the tube network. And interestingly enough, they found that there wasn't at all. Were you surprised to learn of the results of that study, given London's increasing number of cases?
Well, I was interested to see that article, and I took a close look at the methods they use and the way that COVID is spread. One of the things that Transport for London have done pretty well is improve cleaning, and that has clearly made a difference here. We think, the latest scientific evidence is that there are 3 ways in which COVID is transmitted. And the first is from surfaces. So people traveling with the infection sneeze, they leave residues on handles and poles. Someone else comes along and touches them, then touches their face. They've got the disease. And the cleaning regime was designed to stop that. And clearly from the Imperial College tests, it's actually worked pretty well. The second way you can get it is from airborne particles. And again, the Imperial College airborne tests are showing that there aren't any of those, which is good as well. But of course, the third way you can get COVID is by contact with people who are carriers. And unless you identify those carriers and stop them using the transport network, I don't think you can actually say that the underground is COVID free, because it just takes someone to walk through the gates and travel in a crowded carriage, and it's not been COVID free for that period of time. So whilst I think the test shows a lot of the work Transport for London has done has been really good, they've done the best they can, I wouldn't go so far as to say there is no COVID on the tube and it is completely safe to travel. And certainly I don't travel by public transport unless I absolutely have to. And I think that's a sensible approach for anyone else in London at the moment.
Well, as you've probably been able to ascertain from my questions earlier, I'm rather skeptical of testing methods. So, but it was an interesting study nonetheless. Talking of Transport for London, apparently TfL were awarded winners of the 2020 Public Transport Authority Award by the Electric Vehicle World Congress. How did you react to hearing that news?
Well, I didn't see it, but I'm a bit surprised. If it's about their own electric vehicles, actually perhaps they've got a point, because there are a lot of hybrid buses which use electrical power, There's a lot of renewable electricity now used in operating London Underground. But if you're talking about facilitating use of electric cars, their record's not been very good. They've failed to provide the charging points which you need within London to encourage the use of that technology. And that's been an ongoing problem. But I'm on a wider basis, I'm always a bit skeptical of industry awards. I've been to enough events where people pass awards around and slap each other on the back, and it's a great opportunity for everyone to get publicity and have a good night out and network and meet their peers. But I'm not sure that the awards mean that much in the end.
I have to say, personally, I couldn't stop laughing when I heard that announcement. And on that bombshell, we've come to the end of yet another show. My thanks once again, as always, to Roger for his invaluable contribution. And to you at home, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, please be sure to click on the like button below, and also click on the subscribe button in order to receive updates every time we upload a new video to the channel. Again, thanks very much for taking the time to watch. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.